So I recently received some training surrounding Bloom's taxonomy. Now, this is something I'm familiar with because early on in any sort of teaching course, it is something that is used and used quite extensively. And I do find that it's rather beneficial. However, I do want to look at and explore the other side and maybe take away some actionable advice within this session. But before I do that, it's always important to start off with a bit of a starter task. So if you are watching through video, what I would recommend is pause this video, maybe take 2 minutes to complete this task, and then come back to watch the rest of the video. If I was there in person, I would conduct this task with you. So I'd like you to reflect on the past 23 years. So since 2001, see if you can list as many significant events as you can during each year. Let's see if you can get one for each year. If you're watching, pause your video now. You've got 2 minutes. Get your list and then come back and check against my answers. Okay, so as you can see by our word cloud, there is a lot of things that have happened since 2001. Make sure you give yourself a point. So each event that you have for each year, give yourself 1 point. If you've got the same as me, give yourself 3 points. Remember things like the Ice Bucket Challenge, yeah? 2011 Game of Thrones, who knew it was out that long? 2005 we had our Nintendo Wiis. We had things like fidget spinners, yeah? Everyone was going mad for them. They were all sold out. Two of the more important things that I would note and mention is 2019 we had COVID, and we had 2023 the ChatGPT boom and artificial intelligence. Those are two significant factors that are impacting education. And because they are so recent, the amount of studies, research, and practical guidance surrounding how learners have changed isn't fully mapped out and give a full, clear picture just yet. We need more information. But if you consider just some of those examples that are on there, since 2001 versus today, 2024, there's a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of changes within the world. And yet, we're continually to use old theory or seminal theory rather than looking at recent updates and criticizing maybe some of these seminal theories. So it's important to always look at the good and bad. Can we view the good? But are there any limitations with theories? In particular, are there any limitations with Bloom's that we'll look at? And as I said, a lot can happen in 23 years. So, in the time from 2001, when Bloom made his revised taxonomy, a lot has changed. Now, typically, when we're doing any course around Bloom's taxonomy, I see people using the image of the original taxonomy and not necessarily using an image of the revised version. So we should look at, looking at the differences between those and making people aware of what the shift actually was. If we're looking at the positives, Bloom's taxonomy can actually be useful for course design because it makes it quite basic and understanding of how we can go from that process of students going from lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking. And you can see that reference from forehand there. What I would say though is a lot more can happen in 68 years or maybe a little bit less. So if we were to go back to 1956 and we were looking at the world in that version, that era, compared to today, it's going to be completely different. And yet, even just from 1956 to 2001, very little changed. So I talked about how there was a revised version of Bloom's taxonomy. In 2001, we swapped synthesis to create, and we put it at the top level above evaluate. However, that's not always addressed and shown within training, so just be aware that there is that revised version. In terms of our criticisms that we're looking at, so we could look at it from three perspectives. We could look at an overall perspective, we could look at the original from Bloom, and we can look at the revised version. In terms of breaking down some of these a bit further, anachronism is looking at the ability of, today's world is completely different from 1956 or even 2001. Things like Facebook weren't even created. People didn't have iPhones. There wasn't things like COVID and ChatGPT that impacted our learners. Equally, as educators, we know more about how learners learn than we ever did. So tutors actually know a lot more than they're given credit for sometimes. In terms of the original, there was a lack of constructivism, so students may not participate in an active learning process. And equally, in today's day and age, through our adaptive teaching practices, every student is expected to make that top criteria of Bloom's taxonomy. So an important perspective for that is making sure that our teaching, learning, assessment is spot on. It's crucial. Our assessment methods, we need to consider them to make sure they align with what the learner is actually needing to succeed and progress forward. We'll look at some of the application of that to real world in a second. Equally, a downfall is the inconsistent application. So based on whoever's using Bloom's taxonomy and designing their objectives, they might use the application of those slightly differently. They might grade a lower order thinking skill where it's actually a higher order thinking skill, or in reverse. So there's always going to be that inconsistency because the way that we view it is going to alter and differentiate between each person. There's a hierarchy of succession. So what this applies is that in real life, we don't go through that process where we succeed in a linear fashion from one step to the next. It's more that succession, it could sometimes come simultaneous. So in a real life scenario, you might develop all those skills at once rather than that in that linear fashion that the pyramid goes against. Pedagogical impracticality, so always a tough word to get out. What always surprises me is whenever you do any sort of training around teachers, and I've done it a little bit here myself, we always say, and we're aware of cognitive load, we're aware of Sweller. However, we will just bombard ourselves with loads and loads of information around these theories. And if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, it's broken into 19 subcategories. So if we're saying, 5 to 9 ideas, and we're aware of cognitive load, why are we trying to challenge tutors with 19 ideas and subcategories that they need to understand? Because that means that there's a little bit lost in confusion. Sometimes we won't apply it practically because it's too hard to in its current format. So I'm going to give you some approaches of how we might address that. Furthermore, when we're looking at the weightings of the verbs, we looked at how synthesis has now been placed at the top level above evaluation. However, what is significant to consider is the levels of synthesis and the levels of evaluation, because we might be doing that at a varied level and a varied scale, which can impact it overall. We might be doing it at a higher level rather than a lower level based on our learning journey, where we are at with it. Another big part of a downfall with the theory is that the application of it almost devalues the lower basic skills, so the things like knowledge and understanding, because they're placed as lower order thinking skills, sometimes in the expense of higher order thinking skills and trying to develop them. We forget the value and the importance of understanding the basic knowledge, basic skills, and we really do need to understand that before we move to the next stage, because we can't actually do it until we understand those foundational understandings. But as I would say, that's not necessarily a downfall with Bloom, that's a downfall with those who are using it, so we need to make sure that we're using it effectively. Equally, tutors, educators may be misapplying the theory. So they might interpret different challenges and order thinking skills at different levels. It might not actually be at the level that's required to achieve that skill. A key area where this happens is at colleges, especially in introductory courses. There's evidence to show that typically a lot of tutors will interpret on those introductory courses they only need the lower order thinking skills to achieve and attain, whereas we actually do need a varying degree of each. Including the proficiency as well. So if we look at proficiency, there is those varying levels. So when we were looking at the weightings of the verbs, the skill levels will vary across each one. If we're at the start of our course, maybe we're a level 3 learner, we might be doing some of those higher order thinking skills, but we might not be at the advanced stage of analysis as we would be in the second year. And finally, we tend to oversimplify learning and thought. Learning's hard, it's really difficult. And when we're looking at that cognitive development, it's not as simple as one level to the next to the next. As I was saying earlier, we might learn them combined together. And there's that process. So some of the key critics and theorists that present against Bloom, you might look at people like Marzano. And he points out that the structure of the taxonomy, moving from simple to the most difficult level, is not necessarily supported by research. We don't actually learn that way. We learn by creating our own, constructing our own understanding, and what we will also do is we might learn different ideas simultaneously through that individual practice and application. Going back to the 19 subcategories, so this was forehand again, and he was saying that it's a complex, long structure for teachers. So remember, think back to the cognitive load. If we're having 5 to 9 ideas for our learners, we're not bombarding the slides, then why are we doing it for ourselves when we're trying to plan for learners? It makes zero sense. Equally, Booker believes that Bloom's taxonomy has been used to devalue the basic skills, so there's my reference to support the point that I was making. So it is beneficial that we've promoted higher order thinking, but we are missing out on those more basic skills. We have Star Talk's argument that all objectives should be more performance objectives, and that learners need to practice whatever they're learning in a real life task scenario. So we should be observing students perform as they'll need to in the future in their former scenario. So if you think about the scenario that they might be going into, we need to measure against what that looks like, what it is. This is where our own pedagogical content knowledge comes in, and our own industry knowledge comes in, because we know what the assessment is, what assessment criteria is put out by the providers, and what we need to fall in line with, but also how we can be creative to make sure that the assessment methods are suited to our learners based on what they're going to be doing as a practical application within life, within that working environment. So how do we combat it? Well, for me, first off, rather than having a pyramid, although that does look nice, we need to level out the playing field. I've seen a lot of sources where they level out the field and they say that all of the thinking skills are equally as important. Bloom believed this himself as well. So he didn't say that one was necessarily above each other. They're all important. But if we manage it and present it in a way that levels the playing field, we place that emphasis back on each individual category being equally as important. And I've provided you what we should be doing for each of those there. For me personally, what I'm going to be doing in the summer, I'm going to be having a copy of this taxonomy where I've got the objectives. I'll be creating my objectives. And then what I will be doing is looking at the next slide and looking at how I can align my objectives and my assessment methods within the lesson to best support those objectives. Equally, I will be front-ending, so at the start of a unit, I will be teaching the lower order thinking skills, and as we get nearer to the end, once we've understood the basic ideas, that's when we will stimulate those more advanced higher order thinking skills. We need to make sure they understand the basic concepts before we move forwards. So, looking at my own taxonomy, I've gave you a few examples of what we might do for each stage. What I'm going to be doing to support this further is I'm going to be going away and I'm going to be providing more examples for each criteria, each little level of the taxonomy. I'm going to be coming up with as many practical applications and scenarios as possible. So the idea is I will have this as a design, can have it on a page next to me as I'm planning out for next year in the summer, and I can pick the activities that best suit my objectives at the right time. And it just makes that process easier. If you've got the objectives that are specific and then you've got the activities that are specific and suited to those objectives, then you will have an overall improvement on the assessment. If I've got an explain or a discussion as a command verb, I need to make sure that I'm doing some sort of task that requires communication skills. So we need to make sure that we've got that balance. There's almost that constructive alignment where we've got the teaching, the objectives, and the assessment methods all aligning into that. So in conclusion, ultimately, as educators, we know our learners best. And the point that I made earlier about teachers knowing more than they ever did about how learners learn, we need to really believe in that as much as possible, but also continue to update our skills. Because we know our learners better than anyone else, we're in with them every single day. We know how they operate on a Wednesday afternoon versus how they operate on a Friday morning. We know how we maybe need to adapt to get the best out of our learners. So it's having that trust in our own selves, but it's also being able to adapt. We don't simply want to say this one teaching strategy or solution is the best. It's having enough tricks up our sleeve that we can adapt our process to make sure that we're adapting for our learners to ultimately receive the best outcomes, dependent on the day, what topic it is, anything. But we may need to make sure that we're adapting to support them as best as possible. We need to consider the impact of recent events. The learners that we have are going to operate slightly different because they've been through some really challenging circumstances with COVID. But equally, we've now got to adapt to things like artificial intelligence. A lot of our learners are using it within their practice. So we need to look at how we can implement that within the taxonomy, within our activities, and making sure that it's a tool that we're not completely alienating learners from, because then we lose that development in that area of a skill that is clearly sticking around for the long haul. So we need to consider that when we are planning and seeing if there's methods and strategies of using it within our practice. We need to pick suitable assessment methods. If we do have opportunity to flex on the type of assessment, we don't always get that choice. Sometimes it's dictated to us. Where we do have opportunity, we need to use our pedagogical content knowledge and understanding of industry standards of what assessment would be the most beneficial for learners to learn in a real life scenario. And can we set up assessments in a way that they are going to go up that progression, they're going to develop the higher order thinking skills within practice, so that when they do move to that scenario in real life, they can actually develop and utilize their skills. Effective usage and training would be another key takeaway. When we're using Bloom's taxonomy, we need to ensure that we're all using it effectively and training ourselves on it. If we simply just look at it and use it word for word, we are going to have complete inconsistencies in the way that we're using it. It may be beneficial as a part of a practice, gathering your team and asking, what's your opinion? Is that actually a higher order thinking skill? How can I challenge that? Do you have any advice? And then finally, the practical application. Educators, we all know how stressed, how much work we have on a daily basis. So we need a practical application. Part of what I'm going to do to support that from this video is I'm going to be going away and creating a resource that has each of the Bloom's taxonomy, different words that should be supporting it. That's going to be backed up by the great teaching toolkit, because the questions that they have is really beneficial and you can adapt them to whichever thinking skill you're trying to develop. But what I'm then going to expand on is having an activity for each of those thinking skills. So for each one, you will simply go along, you'll pick your specific objectives, and you can then really quickly align a suitable activity to support the specific objective within the lesson. Guys, please let me know if you found this in any way at all useful, informative, educational, and please share with me your thoughts. Maybe you want to share some ideas of some assessment methods. Maybe you want to share some activities that can support some of the taxonomy and the thinking skills.